I understand that the weather that you're having right now, many of you deem cold, but for me this has been a really warm welcome and lovely break from the Northeast. So again, thank you. I've been following the development of so many of the exciting projects coming out of the Purview Center, and I was especially excited to learn about the work here toward creating an Iranian gazetteer. As you'll hear, a lot of my own work right now is tied up with gazetteers, so I hope that my remarks today will provide fertile ground for discussion. So with that, I'll get started. Founded by the Seleucids, successively occupied by the Arsacids and Romans, under whose occupation it was spectacularly conquered in a mid-3rd century siege by the Sassanian army, the borderland town of Dura-Europos stood throughout its history on the cusp between what modern scholarship generally classifies as Eastern and Western powers. Given this geopolitical and geographical context, it likely comes as no surprise to those gathered here that material traces to which the site bears witness cut across many of the categorizational criteria and parameters that have traditionally defined discrete modern academic disciplines. Material traces at Dura are difficult to evaluate and understand precisely because of the variety of material traditions they drew from. Cultures that are significantly located on either side of an east-west binary imposed by modern scholarship. Similarly complex, the diverse and contextually dependent backgrounds of the city's inhabitants imply the multiplicity of readings that artifacts recovered in the city could have elicited from their viewers. As such, Dura's material traces are the ideal context for the kinds of multidisciplinary, cross-cultural, taxonomy-challenging perspectives that our generation of scholarship recognizes are necessary. But that's the ideal. The reality is something more tempered by practical concerns and the constraints of history. As the scholarly landscape has historically operated, the two or more culturally or disciplinary perspectives that might enrich the interpretation of a specific artifact or archaeological feature may be originated by scholars who attend different professional conferences, may publish in different languages, and in journals with different target readerships. Such a landscape provides a lot of room by which certain perspectives, maliciously or not, get left out of the narrative predominant in any particular modern scholarship context. I want to plant the seed that if we are truly interested in the complex cultural intersections that sites like Dura attest to, it requires the perspectives of many differently trained scholars, as indeed the original excavators understood, and better methods by which to join up the insights generated by such scholars. It's high time we devote ourselves to utilizing technology in ways that communicate a significant insight or assertion beyond traditional disciplinary and linguistic borders. I'm here to tell you that that technology does exist, but it needs the engagement of humanists. My talk today does two things. First, it tries out a generalizable articulation of how we might use a new technological methodology known as linked open data, LOD, to address the multicultural, multidisciplinary, multilinguistic research problem in terms that are as non-hierarchical and perspectively inclusive as possible. And secondly, it grounds the broader conversation by previewing some of the ways in which the research team I'm currently leading envisions making use of LOD ecosystems to streamline and improve the intelligibility of relationships among categories of evidence normally considered to be the purview of a distinct discipline, while also making ethically significant improvements in the digital accessibility of cultural heritage information of interest to users in diverse global communities. To that end, my plan for today is, after a cursory introduction to the site, to first think with you about the intersection of reasons that have contributed to a circumstance in which the site's longest period of political administration, that is the Arsacid, is also the least well published, and therefore least well understood, among Dura's periods of occupation. From there, I'll turn to introduce the work of the International Digital Dura-Europos Archive, we call it IDEA for short, and share some examples of how we hope our approach can begin to shift the scholarly landscape in productive ways, making it possible to provide new, technologically assisted pathways into scholarly insights, despite traditional disciplinary and linguistic boundaries. That's a tall order in 45 minutes, so buckle in. As many of you probably know, the site known by modern scholars as Dura-Europos is located on the western bank of the Euphrates in what is today Syria. This region is somewhat removed from the epicenter of last week's earthquake, but I'd like to hold a little space here in acknowledgement of the layered hardships that Syrians are facing at the moment. Excavations at the site began a century ago when Syria was governed by the French Mandate. French and American institutions funded and managed the work in its early phases, while an Arab workforce carried out the backbreaking physical labor for low wages under what were often dangerous conditions. More recently, starting in 1987, a Franco-Syrian joint team continued investigating the site, especially its Seleucid phase, and remained working at the site until the outbreak of war, now a decade ago. Since 2011, the site has been ravaged by systematic looting. The pockmarks you see marring the surface roughly every 1 meter in the satellite image on the right are pits, dug in the hopes of finding objects that can be sold to collectors. Colleagues from the Middle East and Cultural Heritage Protection report that looted antiquities turn up frequently on platforms like Facebook Marketplace, of all places. Tragic as the looting at the site is, there's more to the story than is typically acknowledged. Recent ethnographic-style research by Jennifer Baird and Adnan Al-Muhammad has documented the perspectives of Syrians who live in the vicinity of Dura-Europos, and has noted local inhabitants' reflections that Western-generated information pertinent to the site has never been widely available in Arabic. Given the ways in which the local population was systematically alienated from the creation of knowledge in the early era of excavation at the site, and the ways in which Western-generated ideas have never been shared back with the locals, it should come as no surprise that when faced with real hardship, some treated the site as any other natural resource, to be exploited in order to make ends meet. Since its initial systematic investigation, Dura has become justly famous thanks to unique circumstances of preservation that resulted in the site's retention of significant organic materials and other traces of daily life long vanished elsewhere, including the earliest archaeologically known and documented Christian church, as well as the most elaborately decorated synagogue from antiquity so far discovered. Both set cheek by jowl with the worship spaces of coexistent, quote-unquote, pagan religious communities. The mid-250s threat from Sassanian advances toward the Romans' western holdings prompted Dura's military contingent to reinforce the city's western fortifications. Serendipitously, from the perspective of modern scholars, the infill material that Dura's inhabitants used to reinforce the city's defensive fortifications ultimately created the conditions that enabled the preservation of delicate organic artifacts of the sort that are disproportionately limited in the ancient record due to environmental circumstances. The same conditions also preserve important evidence of Sassanian besiegement technique and weaponry, including the use of poisonous gas. But despite the potential goldmine of information that the site is for scholars from so many different disciplines, it can be difficult to understand for reasons that probably have both to do with disciplinary divisions, the long legacy of scholarship on the site, and the intersection between those two aspects. Let's turn now to thinking about the factors that have contributed to the status quo. Once again, given the shared area of interest of the audience attending today, it may come as no particular surprise that Dura's period of control by the Arsacid authorities is the phase of the city that has received the least attention. Given that more recent stratigraphic depositions reside on top, while older depositions layer deeper below, the Roman layers are the best understood and best published at Dura. But the Hellenistic phase of the city, from circa 300 to sometime in the last quarter of the 2nd century BCE, that predates Dura's phase of control by the Arsacids, has been the special focus of the more recent Franco-Syrian excavations. So stratigraphy is not the only factor at play. We've become increasingly aware over time of the ways in which archaeological interpretation is inevitably shaped by the training and interests of the archaeologists doing the recording. And since excavation is an inherently destructive technique, the work we might later wish to do is always filtered through those original lenses. Unsurprisingly, given the era, the Western scholars who came with the Franco-American expedition of the 1920s and 30s to work at Dura were all trained as classical scholars, first and foremost. To their credit, they often recognized the blending of cultural traditions attested at Dura in ways that were rather sensitive for the period. But given their own disciplinary training, they were often better at identifying and classifying elements they encountered that had ties to Greco-Roman traditions, rather than those elements with roots in Mesopotamia or the East more broadly. The field notes and memoirs of the excavators are frequently punctuated with details of the discovery and decipherment, especially of Greek and Latin inscriptions and papyri, since those were the areas of interest to the principal investigators, and perhaps even more importantly, to the donors. Clark Hopkins, field director between 1932 and 1935, distinctly reports the pressure he was under to produce results that would excite donors back home and keep the excavations continuing. As you see from the quote here, there was a perception that certain kinds of finds would open the pocketbooks back in the States more than others. Not coincidentally, the very kinds of finds that the excavators were primarily attuned to and using to convey the importance of the site to audiences back home are still those that loom largest in the current narratives. Additionally, as was typical of the era, the initial publications often took language and artistic style as straightforward proxies for ethnic and cultural affinity in ways that we recognize today are far more problematic. Greek, for instance, was widely spoken throughout the Roman and Arsacid eras, and need not serve as a definitive marker of chronology or ethnic identity. But the presence of such assertions in the legacy publication landscape lends the impression that the site was somehow especially and enduringly Greek in character, in ways that might be softened or better nuanced if examined from the perspective of scholars better steeped in the increasingly better understood Parthian milieu. Jennifer Baird recently commented in a discussion with my students that although there are many examples of a type of lamp at Dura, one of which I'm showing you here, that can be connected with long-standing Mesopotamian traditions, and a full publication on lamps at the site, that class of material has never really been properly studied, much less given contextual consideration or else consideration among other classes of object category that pertain to the question of the complicated mix of traditions that shaped the material products of Dura. This problem harkens back more generally to the historical lack of attention and appreciation for the cultural products of the Arsacids in any serious way until very recent decades. For all the ways in which the Arsacid period is imperfectly explored and understood at Dura, it's important to acknowledge that the site actually played a foundational role in establishing the study of Parthian art as a worthwhile and respectable academic undertaking. Lucinda Durven has succinctly summarized the scholarly attitude toward Parthian art in the early 20th century, stating, "Western scholars considered the Parthians and Parthian art an accident in the ancient world. At best, they were considered to be superficially Hellenized people whose art was a barbarized and degraded version of Hellenistic art of the Seleucid period. In 19th century Europe, a culture that was preoccupied with individuality, creativity, and progress, borrowing was considered a sign of cultural weakness." It was an influential article in 1935, written by Michael Rostovtsev, Russian émigré scholar, cum Yale Classics professor and scientific director of excavations at Dura, even if he was hardly ever on site, that famously stood up for what Durven calls the artistic and political independence of the Parthian rulers with respect to Greece and Rome. She goes on to say that in order to substantiate the independence of Parthian art, Rostovtsev downplayed Greek influence, pointed to the continuity with the Achaemenid tradition, and pointed out its highly original character. Durven and others have shown how Rostovtsev's premise itself displays Western bias in starting from a position of looking for and arguing for originality in Parthian art, and that the characteristics he outlined as defining Parthian artistic style, including the often cited aspect of frontality, are now better understood to apply at best only regionally. Even the applicability of Rostovtsev's criteria for Parthian art, as it manifests at Dura, has recently been questioned. Similar attempts to define unifying elements of a single Parthian architecture and to identify those elements at Dura and other contexts are now similarly understood as problematic. Despite the faults we who are privileged with hindsight might find from our modern vantage point, Rostovtsev's article and other early work to characterize Parthian architecture served an important role in opening up the possibility of a serious study of Parthian material culture more broadly. A lot has changed in just the past 20 years. Only now has our understanding evolved to acknowledge and appreciate the ways in which the art in various Parthian-controlled territories may borrow from and recombine extant traditions in ways that underline continuity rather than rupture, and is just beginning to recognize how material culture produced under the administration of Arsacid authorities may have followed regional rather than centralized trends. And even still, awareness of regionality in Parthian art and architecture has sometimes led scholars to omit Syrio-Mesopotamian sites, like Dura, from discussions of Parthian art, ostensibly on the premise that the period of Arsacid administration of Dura was relatively limited. In fact, however, the period of administration by the Arsacids was longer than either that of the Seleucids or the Romans, so from a site history perspective, it feels strange that Dura would not register as a point of consideration in how we describe the art of the Arsacids. My take is that all art created within the bounds of Parthian territory, even with all the various chronologically fluctuating borders of that empire, should be considered in how we describe the material cultures associated with said empire. If we now recognize that we can't use style to get some sense of the city under Arsacid administration, we're left with the need for a close re-examination of context so that we can get a sense of for which buildings and artifacts there is external, non-stylistic evidence that helps establish that particular object's creation or use, specifically in the Parthian period at Dura. But getting at that context through a sea of legacy publications and data can be a challenge, so I'll return to this point. Anyone who works in an interdisciplinary area knows that it is a challenge, if not near impossible, to adequately stay on top of all the evolving conversations in multiple discrete academic disciplines, and potentially in bodies of literature composed in multiple languages, especially when cross-disciplinary insights might be buried in the literature of a site-specific case study. There must be a better way to do this in the modern era of scholarship. Some of the problems that weigh into the dearth of clarity surrounding Dura's Arsacid period also intersect with overarching, less Parthian-specific complications that arise in contexts rich in legacy perspectives and publications. As with other sites that spark cross-disciplinary and multilinguistic interest, Dura's literature is deep and complicated and often difficult to navigate. That difficulty is a barrier for entry for perspectives beyond the reference point of a very particular scholarly circle, and it can be a particular challenge for those not steeped in the peculiarities of Dura's literature to retether objects, now in museums, to their original contexts and visual environments. The problem is twofold. On the one hand, like many early 20th century projects, Dura's publications typically emphasize the categorization at the expense of context. Like tended to be published with like, with the outcome that often contextual relationships among different classes of object or material that demanded examination and publication by a particularly trained scholar, the context got obscured. For example, when Dura is conjured in North American classrooms, it's most often for the purposes of exploring or illustrating something about Judeo-Christian religions, a fact which certainly ties back to the ways in which the original excavators framed the importance of the city for the purposes of securing funding, and tied to the way that teaching resources about those portions of the city seem to be more readily available because of those buildings' often cited nature. But even in those Judeo-Christian spaces, there are clues to the ways those spaces were inhabited and interacted with by ancient peoples and with much more complex identities and cultural traditions than are typically acknowledged when we teach those spaces. Given the interest in Persian studies in the room, perhaps you know that among the scenes from the Hebrew Bible painted in Dura's synagogue, nestled among drapery folds and limbs are dipinti in Middle Persian, some of them explicitly dated by the mention of the regnal year of the Sassanian king. And those dipinti exist in a space with Aramaic and Greek dipinti and graffiti. All these texts were published soon after discovery, but in separate lists, and not in consideration of their relationship to one another or the painted scenes they modify. Fortunately, Karen Stern has recently turned her attention to doing this long overdue integrative reconsideration. As I've spoken about this site with ancient world specialists who I'm sure cover Dura's synagogue in their undergraduate surveys, they're often surprised to learn about the Middle Persian dipinti in particular. I'd wager that most times this building is taught in North American classrooms, the presence of those messages is not acknowledged or explored with students. The reasons for this are complex, but decisions about data processing at the time of exploration and the inflexibility in traditional modes of publication is surely part of the explanation. Contextual relationships between different classes of artifact and architectural environments at Dura are often reconstructible from the extant literature. But here's where we meet up with that second fold that I threw out there. At a site with deep publication history, naming traditions can often complicate attempts to retether objects to their archaeological context. A concrete example may help to drive this point home and will allow me to begin introducing the potential of the linked open data ecosphere. The causes for the complexities in archaeological place naming are various and can be grouped according to those related to naming inconsistency and those pertaining to name coincidence. Importantly, the complexities described here function at both the macro and the micro levels. By macro level, I mean the potential difficulties of place naming at the settlement level. So for instance, Alexandria in Egypt and Alexandria in Pakistan. In turn, by micro level, I mean the complexities of naming traditions of places contained within individual settlements. That is, the names of buildings and other significant features. What I'm calling place name inconsistency comes from at least three causes that are probably most intelligible with references to specific examples. So first, you have change over time. Many of you may know that Dura was known by certain groups of people and at certain times by Dura-Europos, and then there's this modern amalgamation of Dura-Europos. And that would be the macro level. At the micro level, you have something similar where the excavators originally called this temple in the northwest corner, Temple of the Palmyrene Gods, but more recently, the Temple of Bel has been the more accepted terminology, at least in English. Then you have multilinguality. So, different spellings of the name Dura-Europos, even just the addition of one O in Dura, as many of our Western European colleagues spell the name, can throw off a search. So that's macro level. And you have the similar thing at the micro level as well. Then you have difference of interpretation. So for instance, the Anglo-American scholars often use Dura-Europos, but there's a contingent of primarily French scholars that has opted to call the site Europos Dura, to emphasize the Hellenistic aspect of the city. So that's macro level. Then at the micro level, we often see interpretational differences over which divinity a temple was devoted to, that then have repercussions for the name that particular scholar or collection will use for that building. So Temple of Zeus, the Temple of the Palmyrene Gods, Temple of the Oriental Gods, Temple of Bel, they all refer to the same thing, but that gets really confusing in the literature. Baird and Al-Muhammad's recent research at Dura, which I've already mentioned, is connected with this last category of place name inconsistency. They've recognized, importantly, that The local and Western scholarly communities often have vastly differing narratives of the significance connected to specific places within the site. Different narratives of significance among different populations, by extension, can lead to the association of vastly different names with the same building. One that's perhaps more widely used, and the other more colloquial, but both equally valid and historically significant. So, for instance, among the locals, the archaeological site itself is called typically al-sur, which means the wall. And the site's main gate, like several of the site's other buildings, also has a local name. Western scholars often call the gate the Palmyrene Gate because it straddles the road that leads overland to the city of Palmyra. But among the local population, the same gate is frequently referred to as Bab al-Awa, so the gate of the air. This has important implications for access to information in the digital realm, which I'll return to in the discussion of the ethical implications of complex naming traditions. The other category of archaeological naming complexity is what I'm calling place name coincidence. By this, I mean when two distinct places located at different geographic coordinates share a name such that it can cause confusion in traditional keyword searches. So our macro example would be Alexandria in Egypt versus Alexandria in Pakistan. But then at the micro level, you can think of the keyword search confusion between the names Temple of Bel at Dura and Temple of Bel at Palmyra. My students do this all the time. So much for the ways in which place names at both the macro and micro levels are complicated. It's neither realistic nor appropriate to expect speakers of languages all over the world to agree to a single definitive spelling and expression of all cultural heritage place names, and it's likewise important to maintain differences in name expressions that reflect intellectual, interpretive, historical, or cultural differences. But the complexity of the place name landscape has practical and ethical implications in the digital realm. The example from Dura-Europos is instructive once again. As I intimated at the outset, the site has been the subject of 100 years of scholarship in various languages, and collections of artifacts, documentary photographs, letters, and other archival materials relevant to the site reside in at least a dozen collections across the world. Each institution or database with content relevant to a given place or specific feature within an archaeological site, so in our case, all the content related to the site of Dura-Europos, or all the content related to the Durene building known variously as the Temple of the Palmyrene Gods or Temple of Bel, etc., may use different versions of a place name in their own cataloging practices or in the text of a publication. Notably, given our concern with the Arsacid phase of the city, an inscription dated to 5051 establishes that temple, the Temple of the Palmyrene Gods, was in use during the Arsacid phase. In the absence of the methodology I'll turn to describing in a moment, accessing all the contextualizing content available about Dura, whether that's in traditional publications or in databases or other digital formats, requires command of an impossibly long list of what are essentially synonyms for the same place. The reality of the complex naming landscape makes it difficult for speakers of any language to be sure that they've located all the content relevant to their area of inquiry, and to confidently identify where an object was found according to object metadata, or to be sure which building is referenced by an archival photograph or drawing. This is the problem of discoverability. How easy is it to surface the content that you're after in the digital realm? As much of a challenge as that reality might present to a scholar with the privilege of an elite education, it's important to acknowledge the problematic ways in which such expectations place an unrealistic burden on those who may have been systematically disadvantaged, including the local populations whose families have long resided in the vicinity of archaeological sites. We don't often think about the fact that cataloging language and choice regarding what name to call a site by are both important subjectivities in archival records that can in turn bias the digital discoverability of content and specifically create bias in who does and does not have easy access to content. Ability to contend in a particular language becomes an unintentional gatekeeping device. Even with legacy archaeological content online, it's still not necessarily readily discoverable and easy to understand either for scholars from diverse training backgrounds who could help us approach materials from new angles, or for systematically disadvantaged stakeholder audiences. But it is possible to bridge the tension between the very good reasons for maintaining the complexity around naming traditions and the digital discoverability challenges that such complexity creates. Contribution to and deployment of digital gazetteers within the growing linked open data environment can both streamline and improve the online discoverability of humanities content for English speakers, while also making ethically significant improvements in digital accessibility of cultural heritage information of interest to users in diverse global communities. So what is it? For those of you who may not have encountered it before, the very simplified idea of linked open data is that structuring digital records according to some shared principles that allow for a lot of flexibility in implementation can ideally allow for data to speak the same computer-based language behind the scenes, no matter what human language is used in cataloging. Structuring data according to LOD principles ideally allows for databases to work together, allowing computers to understand complex information and infer relationships between various topics, people, contexts, publications, data sets, and the like, more like humans. This capacity would enable computers to answer more complex questions in much more accurate ways than has traditionally been possible in the digital realm. I've schematized the concept for you here. So imagine 3 separately cataloged and curated sets of different digital information, managed by 3 different entities. The 2 institutions on the left have records for items associated with places marked in blue. Linked open data would allow these 2 databases not only to talk to one another, but also to talk to the geographic database on the right, ultimately allowing the computer to infer that the objects in the separate institutional databases are associated with the same place. The vision of LOD would ultimately create a web of data, like the visualization I'm showing you here, where each node stands in for a concept of a person, place, thing, event, value, and each line represents a relationship to a different node. This web of data maps interconnections among different ideas, people, places, things, events, publications, and data sets, such that both a human and a computer can crawl through it to understand how data managed by different institutions or entities, or ideas asserted by different publications, may have points of overlap. Within this ecosystem, data from separately conceived but tangentially related projects can be easily reused to mutually enrich both original data sets. In the realm of linked open data for archaeology and cultural heritage, digital gazetteers play a critical role, since the primary and secondary source material around which the disciplines revolve very often makes mention of, or is otherwise attributable to, places with a fixed geographical location. So this includes texts and material discovered in the course of excavations, archival documents, and modern books and articles. But it's here that the naming tradition issue comes into play. Digital surrogates for each of these resources could be cataloged in various languages and refer in the object metadata to Dura-Europos and or the specific building at Dura with which all of these resources are associated, with a variety of spellings or naming traditions. This is where digital gazetteers can become extraordinarily helpful, both for practical and ethical purposes. Examples of linked open data digital gazetteers that you may have heard of include Pleiades, the World Historical Gazetteer, and the Getty Thesaurus of Geographic Names. An example of gazetteer record from Dura illustrates how LOD gazetteers gather up all the known name variants for a place, associate those names with a particular set of geographic coordinates, and assign that place a stable non-linguistic identifier. Within the LOD environment, therefore, data managers of various databases and other resources can essentially tag the resources in their online collection with a stable identifier defined for the place with which the resource is associated. And thereby, the metadata for the objects in their collection is enriched with all the various traditions, naming traditions, known to the gazetteer. This essentially means that no matter the preferred way of referring to Dura-Europos' Temple of Bel that is chosen in a particular collection's metadata, be that in any of the various English names or in Arabic script, or importantly, even the colloquial local name given to the same structure, as long as the digital record is tagged with the appropriate gazetteer ID. That record becomes linked to other digital entities associated with the same physical location, no matter how they call that physical location. In this way, places defined with a digital LOD gazetteer can serve as a sort of virtual reassembly node for objects and archival materials potentially kept in different physical locations, cataloged in different languages, and possibly following any number of different naming conventions. This is the approach that the IDEA project is taking with regard to Dura-Europos, utilizing the Wikidata platform. If you haven't heard of it, Wikidata is a free, lower barrier to entry LOD platform used by a growing number of galleries, libraries, archives, and museum institutions. The same Wikimedia movement sponsors Wikipedia and other related projects like Wikimedia Commons, but you can think of Wikidata as essentially the wiki-backed way to translate metadata into computer-readable statements that allow an institution's object metadata to integrate into the LOD ecosystem. Importantly, Wikidata allows users, and this is key, to access data and contribute edits in some 300 world languages, including Arabic and Farsi. This means that by integrating the Dura-Europos artifacts and archival documents held in the West into Wikidata, IDEA has made this content not only discoverable for the first time in many languages, but it's also opened it up to collaborative curation from users all over the world, including those from the Middle East, for the first time in their own native languages. I recognize that all this may still seem a little abstract. So in the spirit that concrete examples make things more that are conceptually complex a little easier to grasp, let me demonstrate the multilinguistic search and metadata enrichment capacity facilitated by the platform. So citing LOD gazetteer entities within the Wikidata environment to indicate find spots of artifacts ultimately enables dynamic on-the-fly map visualizations and data sorting of the type that can communicate at a glance, contextualizing information that previously would have required hours of research, ability to read in English, and access to physical archives and specialized print materials. In the example I'm showing you here, you can see that using this process, we can clearly tether an artifact removed from its original context to its original find spot. The example you see here is a wall painting today on view in New Haven. But we've been able to demonstrate precisely which wall within the Temple of Bel it was removed from by citing the appropriate gazetteer entity. The same principle also allows one to visualize which artifacts were found together in association with a single building or archaeological feature, no matter which collection holds the various objects today. We can take this a step further to even assert and clarify when there are relationships between different classes of material, as for instance a dipinto or a graffito located on a particular section of a wall painting. So we can use this process to effectively digitally recreate archaeological assemblages. But further, just creating records for these artifacts in the Wikidata environment now means that these items are discoverable in hundreds of world languages at a basic level, without any translation work on our part. I'm showing you here a Wikidata relief record for a relief kept in the Yale University Art Gallery that depicts Heracles wearing the Nemean lion skin. Thanks to the recent funding from the NEH, IDEA's Arabic translation team, which is headed by our Syrian colleague Adnan Al-Muhammad, is in the process of providing Arabic translations of all the labels and all the inscription translations for the sites, all the descriptions of the objects. But even before they began that work, thanks to the global Wikidata editorial community, widely shared concepts that are relevant to records from Dura-Europos, like archaeological artifact, have been translated into various world languages, as has the concept associated with the god known as Heracles. In practice, this means an Arabic or Japanese speaker, for instance, would be able to search in their own native language for the equivalent of archaeological artifact depicting Heracles, and turn up the same results as someone searching in English. The LOD ecosystem also features a host of simple tools that can be harnessed to begin making more transparent the contextual relationship between different classes of content, like architecture, inscriptions, artifacts, plans, and archival photographs. An image like the one you see here was originally cataloged in the archive as a field photograph of the temple of the Palmyrene gods. And remember, that's the temple with all the various naming traditions. There was no mention in the metadata, for instance, that the image contained a human figure, since the man in this image was conceived of as a reference scale by the excavators. But LOD image annotations tools allow users to assert information contained within an image, but not necessarily expressed by its original metadata. Using image annotation tools in the Wikidata context thereby adds human and computer-readable metadata statements to the record for the digital surrogate in question. Increasing the number of metadata statements on any visual resource multiplies the number of paths by which to discover a resource. And remember that each of these areas of metadata field have been translated into hundreds of different languages. Imagine a similar intervention for this photograph, which was originally cataloged according to its building name and iconography, with no mention in the metadata that the image contained a Middle Persian inscription. That inscription can be hard to find if you don't know where to look. In effect, these kinds of tools allow contributors to make apparent to computers what might be implicit to an informed human viewer. Namely, that this photograph from Dura's synagogue depicts a panel of wall painting from a particular wall in the assembly hall. And contained within that photograph is a Middle Iranian dipinto on the figure's foot. And we can point back to a separate Wikidata record for the dipinto with information with a transcription and translations in multiple languages with citations that point back to the original analog editions or in fact to any new ones that might emerge. Similar annotations could be made about the iconography or the costume in the image. There's lots more to say about the nuts and bolts of how our team is using LOD to provide better pathways for scholarly research purposes, while also making ethically significant improvements in the digital accessibility of cultural heritage information. But since I've kept you here for long enough, let me just tease you with one further idea that may be of particular interest to this audience. We could take the same concept I've just introduced with regard to place naming, and by analogy, do something similar for mapping the complexity of political administration dates at a particular site, and even allow comparison of content securely connected with the Parthian phases of other cities. So for instance, traditionally the Arsacid phase at Dura is pegged as starting around 113 BCE, according to Alfred Bellinger. But Leonardo Gregorati has recently argued for adjusting the start date to 115 BCE. One of the benefits of working in the kind of linked open data environment our project is using is that it's possible to assert two competing values, both grounded in the scholarly literature, and carry that complexity through multilinguistically when labeling a building or artifact as pertaining to Dura's Arsacid phase. I should underline here that all statements in the Wikidata ecosystem in which we're working are meant to be grounded with citations. Cultural labels are, of course, a thorny issue, and I would argue that such a label should only be used when there's more than stylistic evidence upon which to assert the object or monument's connection with the Arsacid phase, such as inscriptional attestation or stratigraphic information. That caveat aside, there's a whole aspect of the LOD ecosystem, of which the Periodo project is a leader, that's devoted to accurately mapping scholarly assertions about the changing geographic and chronological limits of cultural periods. So suppose a computer knows that scholars A and B have asserted slightly different dates for the Arsacid administration of Dura. And Dura's specific Arsacid phase is conceptually related to a more general Parthian concept, which also contains representations of the specific Parthian dates at other cities. In that case, it's possible to label data with precision while enabling searches for Parthian-era material across archaeological sites. This is a comparatively newer frontier in LOD, so you'll have to stay tuned for developments. Shades of difference that can be communicated via carefully argued caveats in text have traditionally been difficult for computers to understand. The risk of flattening that complexity is one of the inherent challenges of making humanities data digital. But LOD is changing the landscape rapidly. The LOD movement is the digital data management strategy that art and architecture from the culturally layered, hybridized parts of the ancient world has needed. What makes art and architecture from such areas difficult, but also endlessly interesting, is the complex blending of traditions and the potential for multivocality. Any single scholar is potentially unequipped to parse such an artifact without some sort of bias. We're always going to read evidence from the perspective of our disciplinary training. That's why we need multiple perspectives to understand such artworks. But traditional publication strategies complicate the reality of working cross-disciplinarily. I want to be clear as I close that I'm not arguing that digital interfaces should supplant the need for traditional publications that argue our ideas and insights. But what more could we accomplish if traditional publications were more consistently supplemented by the technologies like this in the future? If you find yourself organizing your research data in databases or spreadsheets, it's likely you're already sitting on troves of verifiable knowledge that can be traced back to its publication source that could be contributed to this ecosystem with minimal modification. Imagine a world in which you publish a peer-reviewed article, and at the same time, you also publish into this ecosystem a series of linked open data statements about the monuments, artifacts, historical figures, text, etc., that are cited in your article. And these new statements are linked back to your new piece of scholarship. Working through the network of the web of data, by the means that I've begun to sketch for you here, such assertions transcend disciplinary and linguistic boundaries instantaneously. This is the future of multidisciplinary scholarship, and frankly, it's the direction of technological developments with AI. I invite any of you who are interested in shaping the AI knowledge base based on grounded research rather than YouTube videos to join me in experimenting in the linked open data space. In fact, part of the role that I had envisioned for this talk is as an invitation to established and emerging scholars from different disciplinary perspectives, especially those trained in traditionally Near Eastern areas, to join us in this work. If you or your students have the interest and skill sets to help us re-examine this unique legacy archaeological data set in light especially of its Mesopotamian and Iranian ties and characteristics, so that it can be made as useful and discoverable as possible for a much broader audience, I welcome you to be in touch. Thank you very much.